Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I am Abbas Kadhim, the Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And as we are continuing our commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq and the regime change and the post-invasion era, we are honored to present you again with another extraordinary event, as in my estimation, and I'm confident it will be. It is an on-the-record event. You are welcome to tweet the content that you will hear or use the information that you will be presented with. The event of today is about energy. It is both timely as its relevance to the invasion anniversary, but also it is relevant to today's world politics and regional politics in the Middle East, and certainly Iraqi politics and Iraqi economy. Reimagining a way forward, Iraq's economy and energy sector in the post-invasion era is our title, but I am sure the conversation will take us beyond that. We are honored to have with us Mr. Majid Jafar. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Crescent Petroleum, and he is also the founding sponsor of our Iraq Initiative program. Thank you very much to Majid and to Crescent Petroleum for making our Atlantic Council's work on Iraq possible. We are also joined by Ambassador al-Rahim, the co-founder and president of the Iraq Foundation. She is also, I'm honored to say, on our advisory committee and a great supporter of our Iraq work. And there is with us as well from Iraq, I believe, via the Zoom, Ahmed Tabaqchali, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a personal friend and one of Iraq's top intellectuals on finance and also on the economics. Thank you, Ahmed, for joining us. This event will be capably moderated by my friend and my colleague, Landon Durrance, who is the Senior Director and the Director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us, and I welcome you and invite you to enjoy this event. Landon, it's to you.
Abbas, thanks so much. Again, Landon Durrance, the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thrilled to have a conversation on Iraq's economy and energy sector in the post-invasion era. Majid, Madam Ambassador, Mr. Tabaqchali, it's really great to have all three of you here. And I want to just jump in, since Abbas gave the bios, and really get to the content of the conversation. Since November, we watched the financial outlook in Iraq kind of have a dire situation with the dinar under pressure. And Madam Ambassador, you know, there has noticeably been a lack of foreign investment in Iraq, particularly from the US and European countries. So I'm curious as to your outlook for Iraq, for the economy there. What economic and structural frameworks have contributed to international aversion, and how do we course correct for that?
Well, I hope I don't sound too hard and too pessimistic, but I really don't see any reason why there should be large investments. There can be large investments in Iraq. We have several problems. One of them is rampant, unchecked corruption. There is the system which is called muhasasa, which is essentially the patronage system, which ensures that the civil service and the ministries remain inefficient and under capacity. There's enormous red tape, which I have recently had the awful experience of dealing with it. It is enough to deter anyone from dealing with the government. The infrastructure is very poor. And of course, there's also, I wouldn't say the security, but I would say political instability. or let us put it this way, unpredictability. The political unpredictability means that you don't know who is going to be making the decisions. You don't know when abrupt changes may be made. The people that you've been dealing with may change, laws may change, and so on. And I want to add a final element to this rather dark picture, which is that it is very difficult for investors to have recourse to the legal process, through the judiciary, for many reasons. First of all, because the judicial setup is complex and the laws are arcane, but also because the judiciary is often interfered with by politicians and so on. So all of these factors make it very, very difficult for international investments to come in, and even for domestic investors. But I want to recall here that in the oil and gas sector, we have had some instability, particularly from the European and the US corporations, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell. They have all, at times, either have had to divest or to fence themselves in ways where they will not hurt the mother company. In other words, the Iraqi setup, investment setup, is so dangerous for these companies that face repercussions at home if they are engaged in corruption or they're suspected of engaging in corruption. If you remember a couple of years ago, as I remember, Ericsson, the Swedish company, incurred huge penalties in the US for suspected corruption activities in Iraq. And therefore, the consequences of having to deal with this system are really dire for foreign companies, particularly European and American. Now, this may not apply to the Russian, the Chinese, etc. Even the South Korean are a little more willing to push the envelope on these issues. But certainly for European and Americans, it is a dangerous, unpredictable environment that's full of pitfalls and headaches. So this is really the sum total of the dark picture. Now, there are some bright spots here and there, but that doesn't affect the overall difficulties of investment. And as I said, the same is true for domestic investors, and domestic investors, if they are large, they really do face the same obstacles, and on the whole, they are obliged to partner with some political entity that will give them cover and protection in order for them to overcome these pitfalls.
Majid, Ambassador al-Rahim raises a very dire scene setter of uncertainty in Iraq. She also raises the conversation of the importance of energy. And when you think of the Iraqi economy, you can't think of anything but oil. Over the past decade, oil revenues have accounted for 99% of exports, 85% of government revenues, a disproportional share of GDP. So I guess, with that kind of in mind, despite its status as the second largest oil producer in OPEC+, Iraq continues to face energy security barriers, frankly. And with the government being forced to increase electricity imports from Iran, from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, what are the most relevant factors to improve the outlook in the energy sector, the energy security of Iraq?
Okay, so first of all, obviously the known context, which is decades of wars, sanctions, and also a legacy and history where oil was politicized, originally because of European colonialism, subsequently nationalizing the oil company became a real defining moment in the 70s, and then obviously since the collapse, if we look back over the 20 years, at the time of in 2003, at the time of the US invasion, the oil production on average, I think that year was 1.3 million barrels. We're now close to 5, 4.6, 4.7. That's a huge jump. Now the potential is far more. Right. Could and should get to 6 and 8 and 10 and even 12. The proven reserves are second only to Saudi Arabia in the region, but actually it's vastly underexplored compared to Saudi Arabia and other countries. So the true potential is much higher. We shouldn't discount that achievement, recognizing all the challenges that Ambassador Rahim mentioned. Some of them are more in other sectors than in the oil and gas, but definitely issues with corruption, with infrastructure, clarity on regulations, and the basic mindset of what it takes to attract and sustain private sector investment and FDI. Having said that, we have seen this growth. We have seen multiple bid rounds and dozens of companies, albeit some, including some significant Western majors and others, leaving. And I think mainly because of the contract model. The original service contract model with fixed fee per barrel is not the norm for international investment in the sector, and it just didn't make sense after a while for some of the companies. That's been recognized, and the model contract has been amended now, although it hasn't been retroactively applied to the earlier contracts, and maybe that does need to happen. What does it need going forward? First of all, the current government of Prime Minister Sudani has very publicly recognized the natural gas sector as a priority because of its underutilized potential, because of the need to reduce imports, to help with the budgetary situation, and most fundamentally because of the need to address the power shortages that Iraq still suffers after 20 years, which really makes no sense, that it's importing, 1 billion cubic feet a day and more sometimes, while it's flaring 1.8 billion cubic feet per day, and it has all these undeveloped gas fields at the same time. So that all needs to be addressed. The electricity sector itself needs reform to make sure that receipts, there's infrastructure requirements on the transmission and distribution. It's not just about the generation. That's, in a sense, the easier part. You build the power station. But how do you achieve distribution, the transmission, distribution, and not having all the losses that you're having? And the supporting infrastructure, whether it's the water treatment, pipelines, the right investment framework. The current government is recognizing that. We've heard and seen more action and positive steps and new contracts and new agreements, like the big one with Total that's supposed to be also tackling the water side as well as a new solar project. So there's still lots of challenges, but I think there is some positive momentum as well.
You break down the idea of the reform to the contract for the upstream production. Are there other very tangible actions that you'd expect from the Iraqi government in terms of policy instruments or regulations to be able to empower that kind of transition a little bit further?
So one which is imminent, supposedly, which is immediate and important, is the budget. For the first time, the government is going to pass a budget for 3 years, or at least the framework for 3 years, because of what's happened typically is half the year has been spent on trying to approve the budget, and many years have gone without a budget at all, and that of course hasn't helped. Resolving the issues within the country on the principles of revenue sharing between, for example, the federal government and the regional government in Kurdistan is encapsulated now within this budget, so that would be very positive. And then I think in terms of, there have been legal disputes and matters that have gone to arbitration publicly, Exxon and others. And that's not good for attracting investment. And the way the ambassador described, it's of course important that when those disputes are adjudicated and decided, that Iraq honors those awards, and there's been no sign that it doesn't, but it shouldn't be going there so frequently in the first place. And that's part of the burden that may discourage investment in the energy sector and in other sectors.
Well, I'm glad you raised this issue of arbitration. And I want to stay on the issue of oil still. Mr. Tabakchali, the Kurdistan region, We've been watching the International Chamber of Commerce arbitration and the outcome between the central government in Iraq and Turkey. And it's not lost on many of us that the Kurdistan region holds almost 20% of Iraq's total proven gas reserves, which theoretically meet the energy demand in the region. However, the KRI region gas production is highly dependent on the political relationship between Erbil and Baghdad. What do you view as the main geopolitical challenge here to gas production in particular in the KRI?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be among friends on this panel. I think you hit it on the right nail, in the sense that the ITP arbitration was fairly crucial there, but also I think far more important than that, the people in Iraq, basically the central government as well as the KRG, have recognized that earlier. Whatever you see happening in the ITP ruling or the outcome of the ITP ruling, in fact, the genesis of the solution has been available in the budget. The 2023 budget, for the first time in any budget that we've had, it's almost like there is a clear recognition for an elements of a solution there to unlock the challenges. I mean, I don't want to go too much detail into how the budget works, but it's the first budget that has an agreement or a framework to address the conflict. Okay, it's not a full addressing of the conflict. There's a lot of issues left to be resolved, but for the first time, at least for someone who spent years and ages looking into every single budget, it has elements of the resolution. Now, but the thing is to really think of how do we address the geopolitical challenges, and there are some fairly significant ones because we have neighbors who have either interfered or have interest in Iraq. But first of all, let's look at the potential really for what the KRI can do in terms of gas production. Without going into too much details or too much numbers and so forth, yes, it has sizable reserves. It has almost 20% of Iraq's proven gas reserves, or at least currently proven gas reserves, because there could be potentially larger. But in fact, it holds a larger portion of our free gas reserves, as opposed to the gas that comes associated with oil production. On the one hand, I mean, I know I'm digressing here, but on the one hand, we've always had a focus on oil as opposed to a gas. Gas has always been the poor brother of oil. In fact, we should really think about that again. But going back into the KRI, yes, it can produce significant amount of gas, far more than it was doing right now. It produces something like 5.5 billion cubic meters a year, but it can do a lot more by 2030, by 2040. But the real potential for it is to address Iraq's shortage for power. Yes, we have in terms of, I mean, everybody knows our challenges when it comes to our electricity production. What people don't realize is that our nameplate capacity far more exceeds or pretty much meets our demand. The issue we have is the wrong feedstock. We don't have enough gas, and yes, we import gas. But with the KRG, instead of like exporting gas to Europe or to Turkey, we should be looking at integrating the economy within Iraq and satisfying our own needs. But part of the solution as well has to come from understanding our own neighbors, how they work. We certainly, as everybody knows, we depend on Iran for gas and electricity. And a lot of effort and focus is wasted, in my opinion, on the issue of replacing Iranian gas, which creates conflict because basically Iran feels that its interests in Iraq are challenged by replacing its gas, and the US keeps on focusing on something like that. The real issue to understand is, given the growth in our population, given the growth in our demand for electricity, we will always be, supply will always be far behind demand. So yes, Iran, we might be able to replace Iranian gas, but we will not replace the need for it because the demand will increase far more than supply will decrease. On the other hand, which is quite clear as well, is Iran's own gas production is pretty much peaked. Everybody knows in the last few years, we've had Iran cut our gas a year or so. Everybody talks about, oh yes, that's because Iran, we haven't paid Iran. We don't pay Iran every year, pretty much. And this year's budget, we are postponing payment for 4 trillion dinars to next year kind of stuff. But the issue, Iran without investments in its own gas infrastructure, cannot supply more gas to Iraq than it is. Every time Iran supplies less gas to us, it's because it needs it for its own power generation, as opposed to talking about non-payment of things. So yes, we will always need it, but Iran's gas production is actually limited by itself. I think there is a way where we all can have some sort of a win-win formula in here if we understand the dynamics of everyone. But once we understand these, and sort of the starting point is if we in Iraq pretty much sort of like wake up to the fact that we need each other and we can work together between the KRG and the federal government on overcoming the issues, then certainly we can resolve these internally and also work with our neighbors in that way.
So Ahmed, it sounds that you agree with Majid in terms of the necessity of the infrastructure. So irrespective of where the supply comes from, that we need the infrastructure, we need the distribution and transmission infrastructure for gas throughout the region. That sounds like it's going to be predicated on additional collaboration between Erbil and Baghdad. Can you elaborate a little bit further in terms of what kind of collaboration you expect to see to meet the population's demand for natural gas going forward?
Well, first of all, I think there's many issues we need to resolve. First one is, currently right now we have the Federal Supreme Court ruling in February, and with this year's ITP ruling, the both parties are forced to address the challenges. I think the first one is we need to realize, how do we look at interpreting the Constitution? The differences we've had in the past were not about the technical definition of or a certain line in the Constitution, but on the nature of the federation itself. How do we see Iraq? Do we see Iraq with a strong center like the past, which I think no one of us wants, or do we want to see Iraq that is actually federal with everybody contributing to it? If we resolve those, then we will resolve the second big issues, and that's the conflict that we've had over the years over the nature of contract we have with oil companies. I think Majid is perfectly right in arguing that service level agreements don't work. But in Iraq, it's a big issue. Most of us are still energy nationalists. Most of us are still look at the strict interpretation of the Constitution, which says, for the benefit of Iraq. We assume by that means we take the maximum right now as opposed to take a long-term view. We need to take a view that whoever is working with us is a partner with us. We need to find a win-win agreement between us and the oil companies. The current view we have, and I think anybody who listens to me in Iraq or if I'm talking to Iraq, is that it's our oil. You got to guard it and what have you. But we need to, in a way, think differently along those lines. If we address that issue, then we can open up our infrastructure, because in spite of all the criticism that people have had of the KRG in the years of developing its oil and gas industry, you got to keep in mind, in the last 20 years, the region grew up from almost zero in both into being a major producer of oil and potentially the most interesting producer of Iraqi gas. And that's because the relationship they have, not all the time, they've had some, there was a lot of issues in between, but at least the contracts were on the right track, were on the fact that win-win for both situations. So I think if we address that particular one, and especially the Iraqi complex about dealing with oil companies and look at them as partners and finding an equation of what can work for them and for us, we can find contracts that will work for them and for us, because we don't have the technology and we don't have the tools that they have. And yet we have fantastic resources that should be taken advantage of. But it can be done in a win-win equation or formula.
Really appreciate those insights. And before going back to a broader political picture with the ambassador, Majid, I just want to go back to something you said. You alluded to the fact that contracts are being signed. In fact, I think I've read in the press clippings that Crescent's signed a couple 20-year contracts for development of fields in Basra and Diyala provinces. How do you anticipate these agreements impacting Iraq's energy system? Do you agree with Mr. Tabachali's perspective that we should focus not necessarily on the supply side, but just on the infrastructure? And then, finally, What are the opportunities, in your opinion, for future engagement and investment in the region? Obviously, you're there, but do you see that you should be attracting other international parties there as well?
So building on Ahmed's point on the contract types, without getting sort of too technical. So Iraq's constitution actually calls for maximum investment using latest market methods. That's what it says. Now, it also states that the oil and gas belongs to all the people of Iraq in all the regions and governorates. That's a sovereignty point. This is a management point. What's the best way to produce it? Now, in terms of the contracts models, there's been misconception that somehow production sharing agreements or investment type contracts are more profitable for the investor and service contracts are better for the host government. That's a nonsense. I mean, you can have a service contract that gives 50% to the company, and you can have a production sharing agreement or even a old style concession or a tax and royalty arrangement that gives 1% to the investor and 99% to the government. So the structure of the contract is one thing, and it's different from the split, if you like. When it comes to production sharing contracts, it's often forgotten that they were a model created by a socialist government in Indonesia to restore sovereignty and move away from the old tax royalty models. And they were used by many countries in the region, including Gaddafi's Libya, Hosni Mubarak's Egypt, Saddam's Iraq, not typically countries that are interested in giving up their sovereignty, as well as Qatar and Egypt and many other countries in the region. Some countries in the region prohibit private investment in the sector, including two of Iraq's neighbors, Iran and Kuwait, and actually Saudi Arabia also. There's a monopoly for the state oil company. Iraq's constitution is the opposite of that. So that's a sort of background. You can have investment type models that align the interests of the investor with the host government with all kinds of range of split, contractor, host government split. And I think now the new contract models, which are a royalty and a percentage revenue, it's a revenue sharing, if you like, are better in terms of that alignment. And that was the recent bid round, the future planned bid rounds, the new contract with Total and so on. So just to clarify, I think Ahmed's point was correct on electricity. The generation capacity exceeds or meets the needs. What's missing is fuel, but we do need to increase the production for gas and for oil going forward, commensurate with Iraq's potential. Our estimates are today Iraq's true demand for natural gas is 4 billion cubic feet a day. So as Ahmed says, even when and according to the IEA, by the way, by the end of the decade, even if only 70% of the electricity comes from gas and 30% from renewables and other sources, that could easily double to 8 billion cubic feet a day. And with all the known non-associated gas fields and the gas gathering projects by Shell and Total and others, you will still have a deficit of perhaps 2 billion cubic feet per day. So you may still be needing imports unless you really push ahead with exploration, as the government now has said it will, with the 6th bid round and beyond, to find more gas as well. So as he said, it's not about replacing imported gas from Iran tomorrow. It's about achieving 24-hour electricity for the Iraqi citizen, which is so critical for stability, for economic development. And once you've met the power needs, your next priority should be industry. How to use gas to have economic value add, job creation, and GDP growth based on industry. And then any surpluses you export. That is the normal priority when it comes to natural gas.
Madam Ambassador, Ahmed spoke a little bit about the politics of Erbil, and obviously politics have been front and center in Iraq since the election in 2021. With the confirmation of the new Prime Minister this past October, many recognize this as an opportunity for significant political and economic reform, and I think we've spoken about some of that in terms of the energy space already. What do you view as the main barriers for this new government to reaching its full reform potential?
If I could comment, I'm certainly not an oil or gas expert and don't want to get into that. But what seems to me as a sort of a layperson is that until very recently, and I take your point, Majid, about the change in the oil contracting and the different view, there were three things really at play. First of all, the sort of old mindset of the socialist mindset. Don't let these foreigners come and control you. That's one thing. The other thing is, and I don't know if the experts will agree with me, we really have not had a great injection of technical, professional know-how in the oil and gas sector in the government. In other words, it's been rather superficial and outdated and so on. And finally, as I look at these contracts, again, as a layperson, what strikes me most is that Iraq has had a sort of an arrogance complex. And I think the Total deal really indicated that, because the only way that the Total deal went forward, as far as I know, is because Iraq backed down. And their demands from Total were for an Iraqi participation that was far too high, and that Total rejected. And then eventually, I guess, Iraq decided, well, if we want Total to come in and to do this, big sort of array of projects, $27 billion, we are going to have to get off our high horse a bit. So the sense of arrogance that I think has affected Iraqi decision-making maybe is beginning to change. I don't know whether you will agree with me.
I can see Ahmed was nodding his head in the corner of my eye, so maybe just an opportunity to comment.
Well, I think she's absolutely right. I mean, I don't know so much if it's just pure arrogance or this whole legacy of anti-colonialism. I mean, Iraq has always thought of itself as, in the olden days, and I'm speaking, sort of betraying my age here, as being the vanguard of Arab nationalism and so on. But I think it's also this whole idea of resource nationalism. We need, and I keep on thinking that the Total deal, like in any other deal, the only deal that makes sense if both parties are winners. We can't keep on thinking along the lines of the maximum benefit to Iraq means the minimum benefit to somebody else. It's almost like the story of, if anybody remembers the childhood stories of the duck or the goose that lays the golden eggs. If you're smart and you work with it, you work with long term. And that's how we should address our relationship with Total and any other oil companies. I mean, no one is there because they fall in love with us. No one is there because we are, God's chosen one, but because we have something to offer and they have something to gain. If we can find the right formula and go away from our prior continuous sort of fears, then we can find relationships with people as long as we know what they want, what can we offer, and how can we work with it.
If I can just, I totally agree with the points of my colleagues. If I can just add to that. So there is this, as was said, this sense of resource nationalism. And it's not without, there is a historical context. Again, once upon a time, the IPC, which was the large Western majors, had a monopoly on the oil sector and would pay a royalty of 4 shillings per ton of oil to the state, and the rest went to them. That's the colonialist background reality. So it's not imagined, it actually happened. And it was actually my grandfather in the 50s as the minister in charge had to negotiate the first 50-50. And that was seen as a big win at the time for Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and others to get an equal share of their own, resources. Today, of course, for these contracts, including the new model that we're talking about, the vast majority of the revenues goes to Iraq, the host nation. Should be well over 90%. For big fields and easy areas, can be 97, 98, even 99%. The issue is, as Ahmed pointed out, the government or the people shouldn't look at the competition as a zero-sum game with the investor. The competition is global. We are in an energy transition. The need, the peak demand for oil, it may be already with us, it may be a decade or 2 or 3 in the future, and certainly Iraq has lowest costs, so it should be one of the last to leave the market. But it doesn't mean you can have this mindset of, I'll leave it in the ground for future generations. No, as Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the famous Saudi oil minister, once said, when we didn't leave the Stone Age for lack of stone. And the same will happen with oil. So the question for Iraq is how to maximize the value as quickly as possible for its people, as required by the Constitution. And then, of course, how to best use the revenue. And I'm sure we'll get into that as well. At the moment, it's all been going on salaries and subsidies and no savings and no investment. Whereas if you look at somewhere like the UAE, for example, Abu Dhabi with its sovereign wealth funds, well over $1 trillion in total is estimated. That means even in a post-oil world, or even when prices are low, as they were 2 years ago during COVID, there's healthy income coming in. And Norway sees the same with its Future Generations fund, shielding the economy from the distortions of oil, the rentier economy, so to speak, and also ensuring a significant percentage of those revenues goes to diversification of the economy and long-term investment, and not just, as it's called, the operating budget, which is just salaries and subsidies, which has just been increasing and increasing without any tangible positive impact on the ground in terms of better infrastructure and better services for the people of Iraq.
So, Ambassador al-Rahim, this brings us back to Baghdad, back to the central government.
Right. In fact, and again, the budget, Dr. Ahmed knows infinitely more than I do. But this budget allocates 76% of the budget goes to the operational side. And that includes salaries, it includes pensions, it includes social security, it includes all the necessities of operating the ministries and so on. 76%, and the rest, whatever it is the investment budget. Interestingly, of course, there's a deficit. And of course, if oil prices drop, the first thing that'll go is the investment budget, because really there's no flexibility or very little flexibility in the operational budget. But going back to your original question, we need to think about two separate things. The government program that was submitted by Prime Minister Sudani is really in two parts. One of them is the part that he and his advisors developed themselves, but presumably also with consultation with the political parties and so on. But it's really a service program. It's a program of providing or improving social services for the population. There is an addendum to that program, which is called the political agreement. And that is an addendum which was drafted and signed and endorsed by the political parties called the administrative framework. Okay. Or the administrative something. Anyway, this is what combines all the political parties, the Shia, the Kurds, and the Sunnis, or most of them. That is a political document, and it has points that affect political reform, that require political reform. Mr. Soudani has repeatedly said that his government is a service government. And I have not seen him address issues of political reform. So I think we need to be very careful when we talk about economic and political reform. Political reform is something that the political parties have talked about, and they've got a paper. Mr. Soudani is not necessarily concerned with that. He is concerned with economic reform. If people recall, in 2020 already, the former finance minister, Ali Alawi, came up with the famous white paper. And the white paper is really a reform paper of the whole structure of the executive branch of the state. It's very thorough. In many ways, it's ambitious, but it has a lot of points that are achievable. That was not implemented, but what I see Soudani doing is, in fact, trying to implement or adopting pieces of that white paper without actually crediting the white paper. And there are some reforms that he is talking about in the finance sector. Famously, of course, you alluded to initially, is the huge problem with the banking sector and the remittances overseas, of dollar remittances, which were supposed to be implemented under the previous government, and in fact are in the white paper, but were never applied. And of course, whether Mr. Soudani and the current government like it or not, it has been imposed upon them. And this is what caused the collapse of the Iraqi dinar vis-a-vis the dollar. I'm pleased to say it's recovering now. But that kind of reform has been adopted by this government, whether they like it or not, but they had to, because the consequences of the rise in the dollar and the collapse in the dinar was really dire for the economy and for people who are poor. I mean, the level of poverty is very high. There are other reforms going on within the ministries. There is supposed to be an evaluation process of the functioning of the ministries and the competence of ministers and DGs. I regard that as being a double-edged sword, and we can talk about that in a minute if you want. But there are certain structural reforms that have to do with the executive branch that Mr. Soudani is beginning to work on. I think it's too early to judge whether these are implemented, whether these are successful, whether these have produced the results that are intended. But at least this is the first government that I have seen that actually is thinking in those terms.
So can we break down the psyche, and maybe a question for the full community here, but I'll start with you, Madam Ambassador. I think, we've spoken of a lot of internal, the aggregate conversation has spoken of a lot of internal pressure for change. Majid also spoke of international pressures, not the least in energy transition, that may leave resources worth much less in the future if there's not action now. And so I guess just thinking about the financial reforms scream of necessity as opposed to actually a reform mindset. What do you think actually is the impetus for the other reforms? Because we've seen success in the oil side, for example.
Well, I mean, Soudani is obviously responding to pressure from below. There is demand for improved services. There is demand for improved healthcare, improved education. There's demand for jobs. Now, the way he's dealing with the demand for jobs, Majid has already addressed, and that is by hiring hundreds of thousands more people into the government, which is the worst thing he can do. But, as an immediate measure, he's doing that. So the groundswell of popular discontent with 20 years of non-performance, of no electricity, no clean drinking water, The schools are crumbling. Just a month ago, a school actually fell, a school ceiling fell in Nasriya or wherever, and one of the children died. This is unacceptable in an oil-rich country which has had 20 years to build the infrastructure. The roads are bad. I mean, you name it. The population is not getting the services and the prosperity it needs and deserves. And so Mr. Sudani, being very politically attuned and probably and certainly wants to fulfill his 4-year term and probably would like to renew, has every interest in gaining popular support and popular approval through providing services.
Rashid Ahmed, I don't know if you have particular thoughts on this same issue.
I mean, I echo the point the ambassador made, that this is, at least from my recollection, the first government that is measuring performance, starting with the directors general and then now the ministers, and basically giving them however many days, 90 days, to achieve certain KPIs, metrics, or be removed. And on corruption, I mean, as she mentioned, there hasn't been the attempt to reform the entire political system. And maybe that's difficult because it's the system that created this government. And there's talk of, do you need to change the constitution? Do you need to change the whole voting system? These are important but separate topics about the democratic system and the political system. But government performance is in a way more fundamental to the issues of delivery and achievement on these unmet needs that the people are screaming out for. Because actually, all the polling shows nobody's calling for, well, as a top priority, not even in the top 10, reform of the constitution or the voting system. They want jobs, they want electricity, they want water, they want health and education, and it's on that the performance needs to be seen. So it is a refreshing change. I'd be interested to hear why she thinks a double-edged sword. From what I see, just having the objective of improved performance is and accountability, if you like, is positive. I recognize that there has been politicization of the civil service, which is dangerous. And it was the depoliticization of the civil service that allowed the economy in this country to take off in the late 19th century, and indeed in the UK, because it was also politicized before then and corrupt, and it's impossible to move forward. We've had politicization of the judiciary as well, as you mentioned, of the military. The independent institutions need to be independent again as part of the overall reform. But to start with, holding the directors general and the ministers responsible for achieving targets in the short term, medium term, is a welcome first step.
Ahmed, before we go to the double-edged sword and back to Ambassador al-Rahim, I think I would love to give you a chance to speak to this too. Obviously, you've been a student of the financial system in Iraq for quite some time, and would welcome your insights here.
Thank you for that. I think, in a way, yes, it's refreshing. It's positive to look at incremental and positive change. The issue that I personally have with the budget, and by the way, hopefully, I have a series of reports coming out. One of them should be coming out this week. But the thing is, which I'll really point out to, is structurally, there is no change between this budget and every prior budget. I think the ambassador mentioned that the big focus on the operating side, i.e. jobs and what have you. The thing is, to put that in perspective, we have an infrastructure that has been destroyed by over 4, maybe 4.5 decades of conflict. You start from the Iraq-Iran war, you go to the sanctions, and then you go to the civil war, and you go to the war with Daesh. We as a country, we need to spend pretty much everything that we have, most of it, on building our infrastructure. But we don't. We go and mostly spend it on the on the operating side. And whenever a crisis happens, we had a crisis in the financial crisis in 2008, 2007, 2009. 2014, 2016, and 2020. And what suffers? Immediately, we hit our investment spend. To give you just a little bit sort of a sense of where I think the big picture is wrong, and we need to address that, or we need to think about that. Because on the one hand, you have, I mean, you know, people look at different figures, but I look at you know, the thing is, we in Iraq pretty much, when we look at our operating budget, we include debt servicing and we include debt payments. These are not operating items. You take them away from the spending, even though they are fairly large right now. But right now we have our, you know, if you look at just certain figures, salaries and pensions consume 40% of the operating budget. On the other hand, you go to social security, that's 9% of the social of the total expenditure. You look at the government's program, because the government has a program, it's up to 5%. And then you look at investment spending, non-oil investment spending, it's hardly 19%. So we have the wrong way to address these issues. And yes, our leverage to oil means slightly something goes wrong, that's the first thing that gets hit. The other problem that we have, and I think it's really something will haunt us in the years to come, is the cost of adding new jobs. The ambassador mentioned that, yes, this year, for example, there's something, an additional 700,000 jobs added to the payroll. But in fact, only something like 75,000 of those are fresh graduates. The rest are contractors who've been working for free for a number of years for the Ministry of Education on the hope of joining the workforce. We have people who've been working as daily contractors for the Ministry of Electricity who joining the full workforce. So the point I'm trying to say is we hire 700,000 from other contractors, temporary, into the full-time, and we only hire 75,000 fresh graduates. Every year, we have about 700,000 graduates graduating. Yes, given the fact that we have issues with you know, the way we treat the sexes, not all females seek work. We've got one of the lowest female participation rates. But so basically, what I'm trying to say is something like 400,000 people enter the workforce looking for jobs every year, and this year we can only hire 75,000. It just shows you the scale of down the line, when the bounty of oil prices goes down or prices go down, what the issues we have to face. And I think this is what worries me more than the small positive incremental changes that I do agree are fairly positive in terms of how they're approaching the issues.
Ambassador al-Rahim, it does seem, though, that the will of the populists is leading to political action, if not change. And we have this opportunity to hold responsible the ministers and leadership, the political leadership, through these, I think, Majid, you referred to them as a KPI system of sorts, but they're being held responsible, need to be responsive to action, but build out this idea that can also be a risk that maybe we're not seeing as well.
We're not actually holding the political leadership accountable. I think this is central, and we have to remember how ministers and even directors general are appointed. The ministers are, and this is true in every successive government, not just this one, are nominated by their political parties. This is a consociational system, a muhassasa, whatever you want to call it. So a coalition. So every political party that is within this coalition proposes its own ministers. One could almost say maybe imposes its own ministers. Now, there's a lot of talk and a lot of actually buzz that Mr. Sudani is in fact going to be getting rid of some of his ministers. Of course, we don't know. There's very little transparency in the workings of government. So we don't actually know what the KPI are. Maybe we don't need to know. It's up to Mr. Sudani to know. But in any case, should he dismiss certain ministers who belong to a political party, in order to avoid a political conflagration, he is going to have to ask that same political party to nominate a new minister. And this is why I say that the political parties themselves are not held accountable. You don't say to ex-political party, well, the minister you insisted on failed, I am going to go somewhere else to choose my own minister. You have to go back to that political party, otherwise there will be political mayhem. And the same thing, unfortunately, is true of directors general. In my view, and I think in the sort of more developed world and so on, directors general are usually part of the civil service. In Iraq, they are not. They're also part of the political apportionment. They're part of the patronage system. So that I, as a political party X, want, Y number of directors general in this ministry. I want 3, I want 4, I want 5. And if Sudani dismisses them and creates an imbalance in this distribution of power for the political parties, he'll be in trouble. And therefore what happens is that you dismiss one director general and replace him with a director general nominated by his same party. Where have we advanced? We haven't. We are still not holding the political parties accountable. Another point that I think is very important, and it really is essential for DGs to be part of the civil service, in other words, they're not politicized. You have to depoliticize the civil service, is that there's nothing to say that a political party can always pull up DGs who are technocrats. They need to be technocrats. They are the backbone of the ministries. They're the ones who carry the knowledge, the historical memory, and so on. So if you keep churning DGs, you're losing expertise, you're losing historical memory. And by the way, I think this is one of the disincentives for investment, because an investor doesn't necessarily go to the minister, but actually goes to the DGs. And if they're constantly being churned and they lack the experience and the historical memory and so on, then you really are in trouble as an investor. So this is why I call it a double-edged sword. In a way, we're looking at performance and accountability, but in another way, accountability is not to the political parties, and you are not ensuring getting better quality.
So I want to take the remainder of the time we have before we answer some questions from the audience here, and I do encourage audience members to submit them online, because we'll be reading them right here directly to our panel. I want to take a step back and broaden the aperture to Iraq and the region and its global footprint. Obviously, it's exporting quite a bit of supply of energy today. And just mildly south of Iraq, you have this year the climate conference happening in the UAE. Majid, you mentioned the imperative of the energy transition that may be happening right now, and just interested to hear your thoughts in terms of the role of Iraq in a transition and how Crescent Petroleum is prepared to adapt to face the global energy transition in the context of climate change and climate action.
Iraq is already suffering from the impacts of climate change, not only in regional temperature increase, which is higher in the Middle East than the world on average, but it is exacerbating challenges like water levels declining in the rivers, which is also caused by additional dams being built upstream in Turkey, for example. So it's not immune to this challenge. And then you have the local impacts, like the flaring of gas in huge quantities in the south, in Basra Governorate, was the subject of a dramatic and extremely upsetting, frankly, documentary by the BBC on the health impacts for the local community. So you have local pollution, the negative contribution to climate change. So capturing the gas, using it for electricity. Currently, over a third of Iraq's electricity is generated burning liquid fuels, which is terrible for the budget and for the climate. So replacing, just as the US or the UK used gas to replace coal and enable renewables. In the Middle East, we don't burn much coal, but it's liquid fuels that's being burned, fuel oil and diesel and sometimes crude even. So displacing that with natural gas to enable renewables, most particularly solar, of course, in Iraq's case, is the way to go for energy sustainability and contribution to the climate agenda. We, for our part, we've now invested as a group $3.5 billion in Iraq in the last 15 years, $2.5 billion of that in the gas sector. We used to be an oil producer when we started 50 years ago in the UAE. We're now over 80% gas. We've reduced our flaring and emissions down to nearly zero and offset the remainder with carbon credits, UN-certified carbon credits that support wind power in Asia to achieve and declare net zero or carbon neutrality across our operations October of 21, and we're maintaining that. But more importantly, the gas we produce in Iraq, for example, by displacing diesel for power generation, avoids more than 5 million tons of CO2 annually. That's actually more than all the Teslas in the world. So the role of the sector in reducing global CO2 emissions is key, and I think Iraq has a key part to play there. And I should add, solar energy is seeing a real focus by Iraq, the federal government and the Kurdistan regional government. And as you mentioned, it's a key part of the Total mega project, which includes water processing, but also a large-scale solar plant. I think perhaps in partnership with Aqua Power from Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of experience in the space.
Ambassador al-Rahim, the climate conversation is not just one about mitigation and adaptation. It's also in the role of technology, as Majid's pointing out here. It's also one of people. And I know in your recent trip back to Iraq this past March, you were able to spend some time and interact with a growing number of youth entrepreneurs. And I just want to, youth is a very important facet of the climate agenda, of COP28. I'm curious in your impressions how youth can have an impact both on the situation, the political situation, the economic situation in Iraq, but also how that can carry out to the broader region as well.
What really is, I find very striking and very heartening is that something like 60%, I'm not sure of the percentages, of Iraq's population is under 25 or under 30, but really a very high proportion. And these people have connected to the world. They have internet, they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram. They feel, they're not just Iraqis, but they really feel part of a global community. And most of them, or many of them, are well educated and can read what's going on in the world and understand it. And they're ambitious, and they want to get going, and they don't. I know most people want government jobs because it's a sinecure. You're there forever, and you get a pension, and so on and so forth. And by the way, the salaries in the public sector tend to be higher than in the private sector, and that's a bit of a problem. But nevertheless, a lot of these young people want their independence. And on the last trip and on a previous trip, I had the opportunity to meet with young entrepreneurs who are actually doing all sorts of creative things. They're doing things with IT systems, they're doing food production. The tourist sector in Iraq is much more lively than one would imagine. And there are tour companies that are headed by young people that will take you around. So, and there are also sort of value-added little enterprises, but they're tiny. They're underfunded, and they keep going on the ambition and the energy and the hopes of these young people. And if we're talking about diversifying from the public sector, this is really where Iraq needs to move. Now, obviously, the small SMEs are not going to save the Iraqi economy. You need much bigger private sector enterprises. But at least one should nurture, and the government should nurture these young people who are thinking differently, doing things differently, and really do not want to be part of a government bureaucracy. And speaking of climate change, by the way, there are many organizations, small NGOs, in Maysan, in Basra, who are working on, especially in Basra, who are working on the issue of climate change, but in very small ways. They're working on water contamination, on desertifications, on the what's called distress migration of families from the marsh areas into much more urban areas. They're working on all of that, but the support that they get either from the government or, I should add, from the international community, international donors, is minuscule or non-existent. Now, I do think that that really should be reversed. There is a program within the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which Mr. Soudani is trying to sort of revamp and energize, which is for SMEs. But again, it's too soon to tell what's happening, and I really do hope that they go to this youth sector and try to multiply, incubate and multiply and scale up these enterprises so that they can be a contributor to GDP.
Well, it's time to take to some questions from our audience, and I'm going to start with you, Ahmed. We've been talking about Iraq's international footprint, and you know, we've heard a lot about the federal government and the KRG coming to take steps to resume oil exports through Turkey, and you know, nonetheless, they have not resumed, and that's despite this agreement. And so, you know, I guess the question from the audience here is, what is the risk to Erbil, Baghdad, and the international energy market of this delay? And what role can the United States, Europe, and other international actors take to help end this crisis?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to understand a couple of things before I answer that. First of all, keep in mind the ITP ruling is not over yet. I mean, we have a ruling over one aspect of it, i.e. the period between 2014 and 2018. There's a second period of 2018 to 2022. Now, if you just look at the award of damages, if you apply the same formula, and I've done that, potentially Iraq could be awarded using the same logic as a prior one, or something like another $2 billion. But this is not the real issue. The other issue that involved is a question of awarding interest payments, because there's an interest payment element to the damage. Some go back to 2013, some go back to 1990, and so which could be fairly high because they're measured against Turkey's Eurobonds. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that there is a financial cost that has not been addressed yet, at least not in the media, and I don't know if it's been addressed between the parties. So there need to be an agreement of how to go on about addressing these issues, i.e. what do we do with the interest payments? Because you know, they could very well be substantial if you go back to the nature of the award. But I think at least in the very, very short term, the damage to Iraq is not as high as people think, because they've got to keep in mind that Iraq has agreed with OPEC voluntarily to cut 210,000 barrels per day. And that's about just under half of what's exported through the KRI's pipelines and so forth. So in theory, the higher current prices will probably make up for any loss, at least in the very short term. But in the medium term, we have to resolve that, because ultimately, you know, the export of 400,000 barrels is fairly crucial. Iraq, if you look at the budget agreement and you look at the Prime Minister's statements, adhered and said that they will honor their agreement, and i.e. especially paying the salaries for the employees of the Kurdistan regional government. So basically, that should be it'll be added cost without the revenues coming in from there. But I think at least in the very short term, it should not be a big deal, because higher prices will compensate for that. but I think medium long term needs to be resolved. But also we need to sit with our neighbors and find a holistic solution, because with Turkey we have major issues. One of them is the water issue, which is very significant, given especially our long term needs for water and how do we address that. So I think we need to find a holistic solution to address all of these. The international community or our international sponsor can help out a great deal, but they need to move beyond superficial analyses, i.e., it's not simply Turkey not playing ball and not allowing the import. There's an issue to be resolved, and actually financial issue to be resolved, and also a larger issue to be resolved. So we need to sit down, all of us, in a way, and go beyond the superficial issues and address the multiple things. I think once they're addressed, maybe we have a promising few years ahead of us.
Majid, there's interest from the audience to know how the ICC decision is affecting Crescent's operations, and would be equally interested to know if you have a perspective in terms of what the global community can do to help address the concerns that Ahmed's just raised right here.
Yeah, so in terms of our operations, they are unaffected. Our gas goes for the local power stations, and our liquids are sold locally also. They're not dependent on the pipeline. But of course, the point he makes, Ahmed makes, it is important for not just the financial losses for Iraq and for the Kurdistan region, but for the investment climate. And I, for one, am optimistic like him. We expect the budget to be passed soon. And that actually is very important. And in a way, at least in terms of the revenues, it makes the pipeline a common challenge for both Baghdad and Erbil. It kind of, and I've always thought this, once it's decided how the revenues are going to be split, how the cake is going to be shared, then everybody has a common objective to grow the cake. The basic problem has been the mistrust over how the cake is going to be split. So I think it could be quite positive going forward. I think energy prices are going to be high for at least at this level, $80 or so for the foreseeable future. The OPEC Plus group has made clear that it will defend that price. And we're seeing China now in the last few days coming out of the COVID-imposed kind of slowdown quite strongly, including in areas like aviation. So I think it's important to point out that when we started the conversation with the currency collapse, it's not a currency collapse like Egypt or Lebanon or, where there's a real lack of dollars and a financial crisis. Here in Iraq's case, I think over $120 billion and climbing. Ahmed can correct me on the figure. It was a specific issue, as the ambassador mentioned, U.S. steps taken to prevent leakage of dollars, elsewhere, caused a short-term crisis in the banking sector. So financially, there's a much healthier position than a couple of years ago when oil was $20 during COVID, and Iraq was once again starting to talk to the IMF. But as Ahmed points out, that can happen again in future. And the break-even price for the government budget keeps rising because they keep hiring new, which means the surplus for investment is shrinking over time. So going to a private sector-led, more diversified economy is the only way that we will achieve reducing the youth unemployment, the jobs that the young people need, basically. And when you have more diversified economy, more private sector-led economy, immediately you have less corruption. The reason there's high corruption is because the entire economy is dependent on the government and contracts from the government.
Exactly.
So that really needs to be the trajectory. And now that the crisis of a couple of years ago is behind us, this opportunity with a bit more financial buffer should be captured. I would add one other positive from Iraq's point of view that we haven't explicitly addressed is on foreign policy. Iraq has excellent and friendly, genuinely friendly relations with every country in the region, as well as with China and India and the United States and the European Union and the UK and others. And is now, I think, particularly in the last few years, being taken seriously as a political actor on the international stage, rather than just a dependent country or a problem. And the recent Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, the final meeting, which got a lot of attention, was in Beijing, but the first 5 meetings, I think, maybe 6, were in Baghdad. Sure. And then there were a few in Muscat as well. So Iraq played a key role and had the unique ability to play that role because it had good relations with both those countries. That also can be leveraged to enhance regional FDI, and there's a lot of regional liquidity from because of that goodwill, providing some of the challenges the ambassador started with are addressed in terms of predictability, tackling the corruption, quick decision making, which is fundamental to all investors, and particularly in long-term sectors.
Madam Ambassador, I want to leverage your rich expertise on the political system in Iraq. And a very similar question here, just compounding on the advice we just heard from Ahmed and Majid. What would you encourage investors to do to help the government address the problem facing investors in general or the budget? As an investor, this person is a specific investor. As an investor, they've not seen the improvements that we're kind of discussing today and the edges. And so how do we inspire change, not just as governments, but also as industries?
If I understand the question correctly, I spoke a while ago about Iraqi arrogance, by which I meant really that successive Iraqi governments had the mindset of, you need us more than we need you. And I think investors really need to begin to deconstruct that mindset. I think it's beginning. I think we have a much more realistic outlook now than we've had in the past. But an investor, first of all, has to show why they are needed. And there are very many good reasons why investors are needed. And I think now there is an opening in terms of working with this new government that has a somewhat sort of broader horizon than previous governments. And remember, previous governments were also hobbled. I mean, Haider al-Abadi had a huge deficit. The treasury was empty. There was ISIS and so on. And before him, we had other problems. So in a way, this is Mr. Sudani is coming in a sort of relatively settled era, and I hope that he does exploit that. But I think investors may find openings now where they can persuade the Iraqi government that you need us as much as we need you, and therefore you need to make reforms. But at the same time, I would caution that any potential investor has to thoroughly understand what the problems are, what the dangers are, and not go in blindfolded or expecting a rosy picture just because they hear the prime minister or ex-minister and that minister talking about, oh, we're encouraging investments. Every prime minister has stood up and said, we want foreign investments. And yet they were not willing to make the reforms that would actually encourage these foreign investors, or indeed domestic investors. There are many Iraqis who have capital and want to invest. They may be in Iraq or outside Iraq, but they're deterred. There's huge disincentives.
Your conversation on youth, I think, inspired the audience too. And so there's actually a question on this issue, which would be to say, on the same set of circumstances, the role on a specific level for investors and industry to engage that youth base, this community of young people thinking differently, I think, as we said. Do you see avenues for industry to play a role there as well?
Yes. One of the great things that exists in the West is the venture capitalism, and that acts as an incubator for small new projects. And venture capitalism, of course, can range from very low amounts to billions of dollars. But I think there is a role for industry to look at the venture capitalism model that's practiced elsewhere and to see if they can apply it in a very modest and restricted way in Iraq. And I think that certain industries who can benefit from some of the SMEs that are being started by youths now should also look at incubating and growing these nascent small projects in a way that will benefit them and that they could integrate into their own much larger industries. So there are ways to look at this, and of course, government has a role to play. But I do think that industries, whether domestic or foreign, should be able to think about how to set up this venture capitalism model and how to look at these nascent, small enterprises in a way that they can make useful to their own interests.
Majid, has Crescent found a way to integrate and tap this community of young professionals to help your operations, or have you seen that same system of SMEs begin to benefit the ecosystem where you're working?
So our policy has always been maximum local content. First of all, in our employment, where we're well over 85, approaching 90% local Iraqi nationals, and not just in the labor positions, but also in management positions. And we've had a training program, and that's on the particular required technical skills, but also things like English language and IT skills, modern workplace skills, employability skills, I think, in a wider sense. And secondly, in terms of service providers, wherever possible. Now, some services, maybe drilling services or others, you need to go to international contractors. But wherever possible, we try to go for local companies. That's not only important for local community buy-in and employment, but your own security. But it's usually more cost-effective and faster in delivery. And thirdly, what sort of used to be called CSR or social investments, where we will address the local needs. For example, when we started in gas projects, local farmers coming up saying, wait a second, you're going to take the gas from underneath where we are and send it to the cities so that they have electricity. What about us? Very good point. So we started by putting in full electricity supply in the villages in which we worked. They had 24/7 electricity supply. So they grew as a result, things from health provision, particularly during COVID, support on that front, education supplies, and as well as working with the local, Rais Baladiyya, Qa'im Maqam, the mayor or the district officer, to understand what the particular social needs there. At one stage, water, for example, was very important. So those are the sort of three key aspects to our approach in that area.
I really appreciate it. Well, unfortunately, we do have more questions, but we don't have time. And as we have discussed Iraq's economy and energy sector in the post-war era, post-invasion era, it strikes me that we also started thinking about the country's colonial past and the consequences that's led in terms of the psyche of the rule of law and kind of the current state of affairs. But I'm really glad, and I do want to end on this issue of hope, looking at the younger generations. So right now, just in the interest of time, I want to provide each of you an opportunity to provide some closing thoughts from this conversation. And why don't we start with you, Ahmed?
Sorry, I was talking to myself. I had myself on mute. That's one of the joys of being online. I think the way I would end it is actually in the bit where I started my own involvement in Iraq. I mean, one of the things that you might not know about me is I'm an equity investor in Iraq, and I've been there since 2015. Now, the thing is, all the risks that we have, everything that's been mentioned, all the stuff that is wrong in the country, that actually is in a way, and I know I'm thinking as an equity investor in which the glass is always half full, even when it's 90% empty. is the fact that all of these are opportunities. If we get a few things right, if we start on the right path, all of these would turn the other way around. There's nothing in Iraq that has not is different than elsewhere. I mean, okay, the scale of our conflict, the damage to our institutions is substantially longer and larger than any place in the world, but it's the same basic needs and the same basic infrastructure. I think, or basic sort of idea behind it is that life finds a way. And I think my experience as an equity investor is, yes, life finds a way. There are a lot of pockets of promise. You don't need perfection for things to go right. They can go right. One after another can go right. And I think I'll end my piece with that one.
Well, with 2 minutes, a minute each, Majid, floor is yours.
So yes, I think we have to be optimistic. Iraq's greatest natural resource is its people, and secondly, the oil wealth, and it has great resources in both of those. And it's vastly underserved in terms of investments, in terms of sectors. It's starting from a low base in so many sectors of the economy that actually the potential, and we've heard that, you know, financially it's in good health, relatively speaking, particularly looking at some of the other countries in the Middle East today. So the potential to unlock some of that and actually advance quite significantly is really there. Small improvements and changes can actually lead to very positive results. So I think we need to be optimistic and hopeful. And Iraq is in a better time now than it has been possibly at any point in the last 20 years, but certainly for several years now, since pre-Daesh.
Ambassador al-Rahim.
Yeah, I want to endorse what Majid has said. And I think that basically when you are in Baghdad, you see this energy. You feel a buzz. People are doing. I mean, they may not be doing something hugely productive or that generates a lot of money, but there is motion and people are very engaged out in the public arena and so on. And I think this is the most striking and hopeful thing. You need to unlock that energy, and you need to, the potential has to be opened up. But that really, really needs, and actually I see the energy in everything that is not touched by the government. I'm sorry to say that. Once the government gets in, you know, it's a sort of mormao, the dead hand. But things that have nothing to do with the government, they are flourishing. Then the government, the state has to catch up with the people. That's what I feel.
Madam Ambassador, Majid, Ahmed, we appreciate you making the time to come with join us today and for this dialogue. I'll just end by saying I think you all three summarized it very well there. Every risk is an opportunity. We need to maintain the moment because Iraq's people are its greatest resource, and those people are Iraq's true energy and hope. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.